We are entering the last part of the semester, which is policy making. But before we start carrying out policy making, let's just lay out some of the foundations materials for policy making. First, for any policy making, we need to set a target. In reality, the target of policy making is quite complicated. It is multidimensional, and very often it is not driven by economic concerns or economic interests. So that makes things slightly more complicated. In this classroom setting, we're going to simplify things for now by assuming that the goal of policymaking is single dimensional. So we're going to assume that policymakers' primary goal is to achieve the full employment. So we mentioned full employment in the beginning of the semester when we talk about unemployment. So let's recall full employment. If an economy is at its full employment, that means it is producing the maximum amount of output given the resources and technology it has. So it's not straining its resources. It is not underutilizing its resources either. So it's just right. So that's the ideal situation. The level of output produced is called potential output or full employment output level. So the goal of policymaking, we would just assume that the goal of policymaking is to achieve the potential output or the full employment output level. Unfortunately, most of the time, we're not at full employment. We deviate from the full employment. So let's talk about two undesirable situations, recessionary and inflationary. So we start with recessionary. So this is two terminologies we're going to introduce ourselves to. But before we do that, it's probably easier if we look at a diagram. So this diagram should look quite familiar to us. So the bold line here is the aggregate expenditure function. Okay. So aggregate expenditure function, as we have learned, is made up of consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. Okay. So what is new here is the 45-degree line through the origin. Okay. So we have a 45-degree line through the origin here. The 45-degree line through the origin has a mathematical significance. The mathematical significance of this line is that any point that lies on this 45-degree line will give us the condition at which the vertical variable is equal to the horizontal variable. So in this case, if we find any point that lies on this 45-degree line, what we have here is the spending, the aggregate expenditure, is equal to the real output produced. So the bold line here gives us the current output. So this cross here, obviously, okay, gives us the macroeconomic equilibrium because we have a point that lies on the 45-degree line. Okay, so this point here. So this gives us the equilibrium output level because what is produced is purchased. So that's when the spending is equal to the amount of output that's produced. So this is the equilibrium output. So let's denote that as Y sub E. All right. So this is sometimes what we call the Keynesian cross. Okay. Keynesian cross, named after the famous economist, the British famous economist John Maynard Keynes. Okay. So this cross here is Keynesian cross, which is also the macroeconomic equilibrium. So this economy is not at the, suppose we're given the potential output level. So it is clear that this economy is not at the full employment output level. Okay? So by the way, in this classroom setting, we are going to assume that unless we are otherwise told, the current output is the equilibrium output. Okay? So we are here, and the potential output level is here. So you can see that the current output falls short of the potential output level. Okay? And so we have a recessionary situation. The economy is producing less than the full employment output level. It is not fully utilizing its resources. Okay? So this is what we call recessionary situation. And the difference between these two levels of output is called recessionary output gap. Okay? So how much the current output falls short of the potential output level, that is the recessionary output gap. By using the same framework, we can look at the same situation from a different perspective. Okay? So this economy now has a recessionary situation. So suppose the economy were to produce a potential output level, okay? So how much spending do we need? So what we do is we extend it vertically to the 45-degree line and then horizontally. So you can find the level of spending that is needed to accommodate the potential output level being produced. But as you can see, currently, the spending is not there. So when you look at, so extend it to the current aggregate expenditure function, the current spending would have been here if the economy were to produce the potential output level. So what that means is there is not enough spending to support the potential output level being produced. So how much the current spending, how much the spending falls short of the potential output level is called the recessionary gap. Okay? Recessionary gap. So be very careful here. Just now we talked about recessionary output gap. That's the difference between two output levels. But here we are looking at recessionary gap. Is how much the spending or the aggregate expenditure falls short of the potential output level, this distance here. Okay. Another way to look at the same thing, but this time we're going to turn to a different framework. This is the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. The good thing about using aggregate demand, aggregate supply model is that the effect on the price level is very straightforward. It's very easily observable. Okay. So this is an aggregate demand, aggregate supply model instead of the aggregate expenditure function. Okay. So the difference between the two potential output level, the difference between the potential output level and the equilibrium real output level is once again called the recessionary output gap. Okay, so let's take a step back. Okay. Keynesian cross, this model. Okay. Many economists will refer to that as Keynesian cross, but some textbook would call that the expenditure equilibrium framework, income expenditure equilibrium framework. So Now let's go back to the definition. What is that? Okay, so now let's go back to the definition. Recessionary gap. That's the amount by which aggregate expenditure at full employment falls short of full employment output level. So that's what we have just seen, just here. Okay? So if the economy were to produce a potential output level, our spending would have been here, okay? But that's less than what is needed to support the potential output level. And the amount is the recessionary gap. And then we have the recessionary output gap or GDP gap. That's the amount by which equilibrium GDP falls short of full employment GDP. So let's take a look at it again. That's the difference between the two output level. Okay? So now we can turn to another situation, inflationary situation. So once again, we're going to introduce ourselves to these terminology. But before we do that, let's take a look at the graphs. So once again, we're going to first look at the income expenditure equilibrium framework or the Keynesian cross. Okay? So once again, we have this aggregate expenditure function, which is the bold line here, the black line here, and then the 45-degree line through the origin. Okay? So the intersection between these two lines obviously gives us the equilibrium output level, which is often assumed to be the current output level unless we are otherwise told. And then we are given the potential output level or full employment output level. So you can obviously see that currently the equilibrium output level exceeds the potential output level. So that means this economy stretches beyond its fullest capacity. This economy is producing more than the potential output level. So obviously it's straining some of its resources. For example, workers may be asked to work overtime. And also, companies may compete fiercely for qualified workers, and in the process, they bid up the wages. So that can create inflationary pressure. So the difference between these two output level is called the inflationary output gap. Okay? So we have an inflationary situation. How much the current output exceeds the potential output level will give us the inflationary output gap. Okay. So another way to look at the same thing by using the same framework. Okay. So suppose the economy were to produce a potential output level. Okay. So if you extend it to the 45-degree line vertically and then horizontally. So this is how much the spending that is needed to support this much being produced. Okay? But you can see that we would not have spent that little. Okay? Because when you extend it to the aggregate expenditure function, you find that if the economy were to produce a potential output level, the economy would have spent this much, which exceeds the amount that is needed to support the potential output level. So there would be too much spending. So that's why the economy doesn't end up producing the potential output level. It's producing more than that. So how much the aggregate expenditure exceeds the potential output level, the vertical distance here, is called the inflationary gap. So once again, we can use the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model to analyze the same situation. So just now we look at the income expenditure equilibrium models or Keynesian cross. So now we look at the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. So this is the macroeconomic equilibrium, which is this is the equilibrium output level, which is often assumed to be the potential, which is often assumed to be the current output. You can see that the current output exceeds the potential output level. So we have an inflationary situation. So the difference between these two is called the inflationary output gap.